I want to give this booktube thing a shot because I love reading, I love books, and I didn't even really know it was a thing until recently. So I wanted to start off, this may or may not be the first video on the channel, I wanted to start off with a biography of a reader, a biography of me as a reader. Now, it's not going to be exhaustive, but it's going to hit the highlights of things that I love to read. So obviously I'll need to start back at the beginning. And the beginning for me, I've never known a time when I didn't like to read and or know how to read. But the most first distinct memory of a specific book, or in this case a book series, comes from first grade. My aunt, who lived at my grandparents' at the time, and where I would go after school, she had a set of classic Nancy Drew books. Now, right above the book, yeah, right over there, are the rest of them. But she had this set in her bedroom. And I don't know what caught my attention, but I wanted to read them. And so I asked my mom if I could read them, and she said that I had to call my aunt at work and ask her if I could read them. And so, yes, in first grade, I called to ask to see if I could read these books. And of course I did. And I had read the entire collection, not just of what my aunt had, but of what the library had by the end of like 4th or 5th grade. Now, so this became a trend of books that I liked as a kid, strong female heroine and, detective. Loved Matilda. Didn't read the books, but loved the movie. That became a theme in my reading. The next was a series, a well-known, well-beloved series. Another aunt, my mom's other sister, had this series. Not these specific books, okay? And that is The Chronicles of Narnia. Now, The Chronicles of Narnia were probably some of my first obsessed with books. I absolutely loved them. And the set that she had was in publication order. And I'm one of those who firmly believes that you need to read them in publication order. And I had a set, recently upgraded it. I'll talk about that in another video. That was not in publication order, but I decided I wanted nice copies. And so I got this set, which I'll show in more detail again later. But this set, and yes, it says that The Magician's Nephew is book 1. I read it as book 6. But I fell in love with Narnia. Absolutely loved everything about that. Watched the old movies, not the ones that were done in the early 2000s, which I loved the first one and the third one, and I wish they'd done all of them, but whatever. Anyway, so that started me down the fantasy road. And, so I've got the female detective things. I've got fantasy. And so I had a friend that I knew in 4th grade. She got all of the Redwall books. So I loved the Redwall books. I don't anymore because they're very formulaic. However, she also had some mass market paperbacks of Lord of the Rings. Yeah, you probably could figure out where this was going. And I absolutely loved Lord of the Rings. So I borrowed them. I just heard about it. I'd never read it. No one in my family had read it. And then she moved to a different school and we lost contact and I never got the books back to her. But I don't actually own those books anymore. I ended up giving them away. What I do own is this copy right here. I also have another version that I'll show in my birthday haul video, but this version right here means a lot to me. And you can tell it's seen a few things. It actually sat in my trunk for a while. I'm not really sure why. Busy college student. But this is a 3-in-1 version. Obviously, it was published after the movies came out because that is a movie still. And I worked on custodial crew as a junior because my complicated. But anyway, I worked like 1 day a week, and so I earned about $20 a week. And I remember being so excited. I cashed my check, and I went across to the campus bookstore because my school was on the campus of university. I saw this. I spent my entire paycheck on this book. And I was so excited. Even though I have a new updated version, I will always keep this one because of how special it is to me. Now, I have read Lord of the Rings more times than I can count. I've seen the movies multiple times. I've actually seen the 3 Hobbit movies only once. Don't get me started on that. But I absolutely love the mythology here. I read the Silmarillion in high school. It's pretty complicated stuff. It's not like, it's high fantasy. And I absolutely love it. I love language. I love the fact that Tolkien created his own languages. You could tell in the stories themselves that he put so much of himself in there. Now, I'm still a huge Lord of the Rings fan. Then, so that started about junior high. I read it in junior high, and I just remembered another story. So that's when I read it for the first time and fell in love with it. I've never been much of a public speaker until I started teaching. Now, back in junior high, middle school, absolutely petrified. But for some reason, I wanted to try out for the school play in 8th grade. To this day, I'm really not sure why I did, but the poem that I chose was The Lay of Luthien, and I read that. Now, I'm so thankful they didn't choose me because I don't even know why I tried out, but that's how much I love Lord of the Rings. Then we get into high school, and so I'll touch on this in a minute, but I grew up in a very conservative Christian environment, home, family, school, and so Harry Potter was not something that was talked about. And if it was this new evil pop culture thing that was coming around. And it didn't actually cross my radar until I started seeing it on the news for Goblet of Fire. And I believe that was 2000. And I remember seeing all of the hype and going, oh, that's so stupid. That book is so hyped up. I'm going to write my own version and it's going to become as popular. Clearly. I haven't done that. But a friend, the mom of a friend, came to me. So I think I was a sophomore in high school. And she asked me if I would read the first 4 books in the series, the 4 books in the series at that time, and see if they were okay for her daughter to read. And so I did. And I absolutely fell head over heels from page 1. It grabbed my attention and never let go. So this is the copy that I have to show. This is actually a more recent copy because I had a version that I had purchased, and when I got it, I purchased it off Amazon, and when I got it, I'm like, oh yay, it's the British version that says Philosopher's Stone. And then a few years ago, one of my students wanted to get into Harry Potter, and I'm like, oh, I have the book. Let me loan it to you. And so I did. And I mean, I don't generally care if I don't get books back, and I never got it back. But the thing about it was, it had the earlier version. It had the earlier version of Dumbledore on there. The younger version. The one that actually looks crazily enough like Jude Law. But so I finally got around, and I knew that I wanted this version. Of course, I'm going down a rabbit hole with those. But going back to when I first read the first 4 books, I remember, like, that weekend, devoured them in a weekend, including Goblet of Fire, as a high school sophomore in one afternoon slash early evening, Sunday afternoon. um, and I was hooked. I couldn't wait for the other books to come out. I talked about it with my friends. I absolutely loved it. And it's something that first, like, my mom was a lot more conservative than I, raised in a lot more conservative environment than I was. And at that point, she had issues with it. But she told me, it's okay if you read them because I know that you're a discerning reader. And so that meant a lot to me. And of course, she's come around now. She doesn't really know much about it, but 4 years ago when we went to the studio tour in London, she went with me, laughed at me nerding out at all the stuff. But be that as it may, that was my next big thing. But most of the books, however, that I read as a high schooler getting into college, they were Christian historical fiction. Now, I love history. I have 2 degrees in history. I teach history. I considered getting a doctorate in history. So, and I love to read and I love fiction. So obviously, historical fiction has long been something that I have read a lot of. And at that point, what I was exposed to was Christian historical fiction. And I didn't really know any better. I mean, at school, we would read the classics. Like in high school English, we would read Shakespeare, To Kill a Mockingbird, things like that. But other than like the classics, I didn't really know about anything else. And so most of my collection was filled with books like this. Now, the fact that I still have this book means that I think it is a good book. It's a good example of Christian historical fiction, which, I mean, this is right here. I absolutely love this series, and I've read it multiple times. But as I got into college and was working on my history degree, it was actually the training there, same school that I went to for high school. It was that training that helped me like actually start digging in and analyzing the characters and not the well, in terms of history, it's the historical characters, the actual people. But in terms of applying that to fiction, which is what I applied it to as well, like looking at them, looking at what was going on, and I would read these things from authors that I would go to the local bookstore, local Christian bookstore, and I'd say, oh, it's so-and-so has written another book. I'm going to buy it. I've got the money. And I would just buy it and then read it. But as I started to do that after getting this training, I'm like, wait a second. These characters are so uninteresting. They're so flat. They're so predictable. The plot was incredibly predictable. It was almost the same every time. It was set in almost the same setting every time. There's like it's like they have a bag of different settings. You can choose one of these. Don't venture out of that. It's like there's Amish, there's the West, there's World War II, there's Civil War. Oh, and Scotland. Anything to do with Scotland. Of course, I love Scotland, but be that as it may. The settings were used over and over and over again. The characters didn't seem all that different from each other. The plots were entirely predictable. And a lot of these books would have pages, multiple pages of sermons, like written out sermons, paragraphs of cited scripture, literally preaching at the reader. And I started to think, wait a second, who do you think is buying these books? Like, who are the people that are buying these books? I don't think those are the people that you need to be preaching to. And if you decide to preach to them, and someone, if someone, outside the choir, so to speak, picks up this book, preaching in the pages of a book is not going to get you there. And so as I noticed that any of my books that fell into that category, checked them. And so I've gotten rid of a lot of those. I actually have a stack of books right down there that I'm going to be donating to this local book sale that we have, where I absolutely, she was one of my favorite authors, but recently I've noticed some very troubling things about her politics and her interpretations of scripture. So I don't want her books anymore. So I'm getting rid of those. I just have to actually take them down to the donation site, which, they'll go quickly. They'll raise money for the local literacy association. So I'm okay with that. And so I started pruning out those books. I have maybe 2 shelves left of these when I used to have 200 of them. Not any bit of hyperbole. And so at the same time that I was moving away from those Christian historical fiction, I started moving more towards actual works of history. Obviously, I'm training in it. And so, as an example, I have Team of Rivals, Doris Kearns Goodwin. I can't say her name. Doris Kearns Goodwin. She's phenomenal. The author that first grabbed my attention is David McCullough, John Adams, Truman, all sorts of really good stuff. And so I started picking up those books. A lot more history books, nonfiction, still not a ton, because I wanted to own only those books that were actually really good. And as I've mentioned in passing, I did train to become a teacher. I now teach. So I was very pragmatic, and so because I love reading, I was like, well, let me do social studies and ELA. And so in my training to teach English, I was like, you know what? I want to have good books on my shelves. I want to have things to recommend to my students. And I didn't know that much. And so I started reading them. Lori House Anderson is actually one that I remember being introduced to during student teaching. Now, this is the graphic novel version of Speak. I have read Speak. It's been a while, and this is in my TBR to read. I'm really intrigued by it because a lot of my students want to read graphic novels. But the majority of my young adult literature collection is actually in my classroom, even though I now teach just social studies. But most of my TBR list is young adult literature, young adult and middle grades, because I teach middle school. And so my reading now, especially in the summer, I read the South Carolina Librarian Association's Junior Book Award nominees and Young Adult Book Award nominees. And so most times in the summer, I'm just reading young adult literature. But my reading goes from, say, something like Speak to something like Team of Rivals, or even, books in Spanish. Okay. Now this is Salt to the Sea. It has a different translations. It's Tears in the Sea. As it's translated. But I do try to read in Spanish to keep up my fluency, because I used to teach at a Title I school with the largest Latinx population in my district. And so that's typically what I'm reading, but I read a wide variety of things, and I absolutely love to read. But some of my favorites are the things that I've profiled, and that's a little bit of who I am as a reader. Going forward, one of the things that I imagine doing are book talks. And Penny Kittle talks about this in her Book Love. She's absolutely phenomenal. Um, and I did this for a while. I didn't do it last year because the pandemic made things so weird last year in school. But I did them for a while, and I loved being able to get kids interested in the books, like Long Way Down. Oh my word, that book is amazing. I would, if I figure out how to insert um, pictures, it's going right there. Um, and so I would do these, and now like that book has been read by multiple students in my classroom because of these book talks. Now I don't teach ELA anymore, and to me that's okay. I have a passion for books and for reading, not for teaching English language arts how the district says to teach it. But I would love to do more book talks and put them out there and make them available so that maybe somebody can come across them and use them and get interested in these amazing books. And also, it's an excuse to still talk about books. So we'll see how this goes, but I'm